Most men believe that if a woman is interested in them, they will know immediately. They imagine attraction announces itself clearly: a compliment, a lingering touch, a direct invitation, a look so obvious that there is no possibility of misunderstanding it. But real life rarely works that way, especially when it comes to emotionally mature women. The truth is that many women become more subtle with age, not less. They become more thoughtful about how they express interest. They become more careful about vulnerability. And instead of making bold declarations, they often test the waters through conversations that seem completely ordinary on the surface. A simple question, a casual comment, a seemingly harmless observation. And if you're not paying attention, you can miss the meaning entirely. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever walked away from a conversation with a woman and later found yourself wondering if there was something more there? Have you ever replayed a moment in your mind and thought, wait, was she actually interested in me? Or perhaps you've experienced the opposite. Maybe years later, someone told you that a woman had a crush on you, and you were completely shocked because you never noticed a single sign. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why today's conversation matters. I'm Lauren Garcia, host of the Lauren Psychology Diary YouTube channel, and today we're going to explore something that countless men misunderstand, especially after 50. We're going to talk about the questions women ask when they are interested, but not yet ready to reveal their feelings directly. Because attraction isn't always expressed through flirting. Sometimes it's expressed through curiosity. Sometimes it's hidden inside a question. And once you understand what these questions really mean, you'll begin noticing signals that may have been sitting right in front of you for years. Now here's something fascinating. Research in social psychology consistently shows that attraction is often communicated indirectly when people fear rejection. Instead of exposing themselves emotionally, they seek information, they test safety, they look for clues before revealing interest. Women are no different. In fact, many emotionally mature women become experts at this. They've lived enough life to understand that vulnerability is precious. They know that rejection can sting. They know that making the first move carries emotional risk. So rather than stepping forward dramatically, they often create opportunities. And one of the most common opportunities comes disguised as a question. Let's start with one that sounds almost playful. How old are you really? At first glance, this sounds like harmless small talk. Most men assume she's simply asking for information. But what if I told you that the number itself is often the least important part of the answer? Think about it. A woman can usually estimate your age within a reasonable range. She's not conducting a census, she's observing something else. She's observing how you feel about yourself. When age enters the conversation, something interesting happens psychologically. People reveal their relationship with their own identity. Some men immediately become self-deprecating. They joke about being old. They talk about aches and pains. They complain about getting older. And without realizing it, they communicate insecurity. Now let's be clear. There is nothing wrong with humor. But there is a huge difference between laughing with confidence and laughing because you're uncomfortable. Women notice that difference. A confident man doesn't need to apologize for his age. He doesn't need to defend it. He doesn't need to pretend he's younger. He simply accepts where he is in life. And acceptance is attractive. I remember hearing about a man who attended a live jazz performance one evening. He struck up a conversation with a woman during intermission. The chemistry was effortless. They laughed. They exchanged stories. Everything felt natural. Then she smiled and asked, "So tell me, how old are you really?" The question caught him off guard. Instead of answering comfortably, he launched into a series of jokes about forgetting things, getting old, and qualifying for senior discounts. She laughed politely. But something changed. The energy shifted. Later, he admitted he wasn't responding to her question. He was responding to his own fears about aging. And that's the deeper lesson. The question wasn't about age. It was about confidence. Women often pay attention to how you carry your years, not how many years you've carried. A man who is comfortable in his own skin sends a powerful message. He says, "I know who I am." And that message is often far more attractive than any number. Now let's move to another question that many men misinterpret. Why aren't you married? The moment this question appears, some men become defensive, others become suspicious, and many immediately start explaining their entire relationship history. But pause for a moment. Ask yourself this. If a woman wasn't interested in you at all, why would she care? Why would she be curious about your relationship status? Why would she spend emotional energy exploring your availability? The answer is simple. She's trying to understand whether there's space in your life, not just physically, emotionally. When women ask this question, they are often evaluating possibility. They're trying to understand whether your heart is open or whether it's still occupied by old wounds. And this is where many men accidentally sabotage themselves. They begin talking endlessly about ex-partners. They revisit betrayals. They recount divorces. They relive disappointments. Before long, the conversation becomes a museum dedicated to past pain. The woman listening isn't learning about your future, she's learning about your baggage. And that's not what she wanted. She wanted to understand who you are now. Imagine meeting someone and asking a simple question about their relationship status, then receiving a 30-minute speech about every heartbreak they've ever experienced. It changes the emotional atmosphere immediately. Not because their experiences aren't valid, but because the conversation becomes trapped in the past. Emotionally healthy people look forward. They acknowledge the past without living inside it. A stronger response communicates growth. It says, I've learned, I've evolved, and I'm still open. That openness matters, because when a woman asks why you're not married, she's often asking something much deeper. Can you still love? Can you still trust? Can you still make room for someone new? Those are the questions hidden beneath the words. And your answer reveals more than you realize. Now let's talk about one of the most misunderstood questions of all. Do you date younger women? The moment this question appears, many men become confused. Some see it as a trap. Others see it as an opportunity to impress. And some start listing previous relationships as evidence of their desirability. But here's what often gets missed. The question usually isn't about younger women. It's about her. Human beings naturally compare themselves to perceived romantic possibilities. Psychologists call this self-referential evaluation. When someone is interested in you, they often evaluate themselves against your preferences. They're asking, consciously or unconsciously, could I fit into this person's life? That's why this question appears. She's trying to understand whether someone like her could realistically be considered by someone like you. Notice how different that interpretation feels. Suddenly, the conversation isn't about age, it's about possibility. And that changes everything. The worst responses usually come from extremes. Bragging about younger partners creates distance. Dismissing younger women entirely can accidentally create rejection. Both approaches focus on categories instead of connection. The healthiest response focuses on compatibility. It communicates emotional maturity. It says that character matters more than numbers. Connection matters more than labels. And genuine chemistry matters more than assumptions. Women tend to remember how you make them feel. Not the exact wording, not the perfect line, not the clever answer. The feeling. And when your response communicates openness, confidence, and emotional intelligence, the feeling stays with them. Something else fascinating happens here. Many women aren't looking for certainty. They're looking for encouragement. A sign that exploring a connection wouldn't be foolish. A sign that they wouldn't be embarrassed if they leaned slightly closer emotionally. A sign that their curiosity is welcome. And often, that's exactly what these questions are measuring. They're measuring safety. Can I move closer? Can I be vulnerable? Can I reveal a little more of myself? Or should I stay guarded? Those decisions happen constantly beneath the surface of ordinary conversations. And most people never even realize they're happening. Which brings us to something incredibly important. Attraction after 50 often becomes quieter. Not weaker, quieter. Many people assume romance becomes less exciting with age. In reality, it often becomes more meaningful. The games decrease. The emotional awareness increases. The desire for authenticity grows stronger. And because of that, attraction often shows up in subtle ways. A thoughtful question. A deeper curiosity. A desire to understand your values. A genuine interest in your emotional world. These signs don't scream. They whisper. The challenge is learning to hear them. And in the next part, we're going to explore several more powerful questions women ask when they're interested, including one question that often reveals attraction more clearly than almost anything else. Because what appears to be ordinary curiosity is often something much more meaningful. And once you recognize the pattern, you'll never hear these conversations the same way again. Now let's continue because the next question may be one of the most revealing of all. What kind of woman do you usually go for? At first, it sounds like ordinary conversation. Most men assume she's simply asking about preferences. Hair color, height, appearance, age, the usual checklist. But when a woman asks this during an engaged conversation, something much deeper is often happening. She's not only trying to understand your preferences, she's quietly comparing herself to them. Psychologists refer to this as self-positioning. When we are attracted to someone, we naturally evaluate where we stand in relation to what they value. In other words, she's asking herself a question while asking you one. Could I be someone he would genuinely appreciate? And that makes your answer far more important than most men realize. Unfortunately, many men answer this question like they're describing a product specification sheet. They begin listing physical characteristics. They create an image, a fantasy, a collection of external features. And without intending to, they communicate something disappointing. They communicate that appearance matters more than connection. Now let's be honest, physical attraction matters. Nobody is suggesting otherwise. But emotionally mature women are often listening for something beyond appearance. They want to know what kind of person captures your attention. What qualities make you feel safe? What characteristics inspire admiration? What values matter to you? Those answers reveal character, and character creates attraction. Imagine two different responses. One man says, I like blondes, athletic women, and someone younger. Another says, I appreciate kindness, emotional intelligence, curiosity, and someone who can laugh even during difficult times. Which answer creates more emotional depth? Which answer makes a woman feel seen as a human being instead of evaluated as a category? The difference is enormous. I once spoke with a gentleman who told me about a conversation he had with a woman he met through a community volunteer project. Over several weeks, they had developed a natural connection. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just genuine comfort. One afternoon, she casually asked, "What kind of woman do you usually go for?" He paused before answering. Then he said, "Someone who makes life feel easier. Someone who is comfortable being herself. Someone I can talk with for hours and still miss when she's gone." Her reaction surprised him. She smiled, not because he had described her appearance, but because he had described the kind of connection she hoped to create. That is the hidden meaning behind many of these questions. Women are often searching for emotional information. Not data, not statistics, not categories. Emotional information. They want to understand what matters to you, because what matters to you determines whether moving closer emotionally feels safe. Now let's move to a question that many men completely underestimate. Are you always this charming? On the surface, it sounds playful, maybe even flirtatious. Most men respond by laughing, deflecting, changing the subject, or making a joke. But let's examine what's really happening. When a woman says this, she's often doing something very important. She's acknowledging the connection. She's naming the energy between the two of you without directly talking about attraction. And that's incredibly significant, because attraction rarely develops through words alone. It develops through emotional experiences, through shared moments, through mutual enjoyment, through chemistry. What she's really saying is, I notice how I feel when I'm talking to you. That's a vulnerable thing to communicate, especially for someone who isn't ready to state their feelings directly. Yet many men accidentally reject the moment. They become uncomfortable with compliments. They dismiss them. They wave them away. They act as though they don't deserve them. And in doing so, they unintentionally shut down the emotional connection she was trying to create. Psychologically speaking, people feel closer to those who can comfortably receive positive attention. Why? Because confidence creates emotional safety. A person who can receive warmth usually knows how to give warmth, and that's attractive. I remember hearing about a dinner gathering where a man spent most of the evening speaking with a woman he had just met. The conversation flowed effortlessly. Hours seemed to disappear. At one point, she smiled and asked, "Are you always this charming?" He could have laughed it off. Instead, he smiled back and said, "Only when the conversation is worth showing up for." It wasn't a pickup line. It wasn't rehearsed. It was simply present, and that presence deepened the connection immediately, because she felt understood, not dismissed. That's the secret. Many moments of attraction aren't about finding the perfect response. They're about being emotionally present enough to recognize what's happening. Now let's talk about another powerful question. Why don't you have a girlfriend? Notice how similar this is to the marriage question we discussed earlier. But this one carries a slightly different emotional tone. When a woman asks why you don't have a girlfriend, she is often evaluating current availability. Not historical availability, current availability. She wants to understand whether someone else already occupies that emotional space. Whether you're open. Whether you're interested in companionship. Whether you're capable of welcoming someone new into your life. Again, many men accidentally answer from a place of frustration. They talk about how difficult dating has become, how complicated relationships are, how much easier it is to stay single. While these experiences may be genuine, they often communicate emotional exhaustion rather than emotional readiness. Think about it from her perspective. If she's interested in you, she's listening for signs of possibility. She's not looking for reasons to disqualify herself before anything has even begun. One of the most attractive qualities in any person is hope. Not unrealistic optimism, not fantasy. Hope. The belief that meaningful connection is still possible. And when your answer reflects that belief, it sends a powerful signal. It tells her that your life may be full, but your heart is not closed. That distinction matters enormously, because emotionally mature women are rarely searching for perfection. They're searching for openness. Now we're approaching perhaps the most vulnerable question of all. And if you've ever heard this question, I want you to pay very close attention. Would you ever date someone like me? Think about what must happen psychologically before a woman asks that. She has already imagined the possibility. She has already considered the connection. She has already wondered what the two of you might look like together. In many ways, the question itself is evidence of interest, because people rarely ask about possibilities they have never considered. That's why this moment carries so much emotional weight. A woman asking this question is often revealing far more than she intended. She's exposing uncertainty, curiosity, hope, and vulnerability, all at the same time. Unfortunately, many men become nervous when confronted with this level of openness. They overthink. They become cautious. They retreat. They answer in ways that create ambiguity. And ambiguity can be painful. Because when someone takes a small emotional risk, uncertainty often feels like rejection. This doesn't mean you should say something you don't genuinely feel. Authenticity always matters. But it does mean recognizing the courage hidden inside the question. Because beneath the words is something much deeper. The real question is not, would you date someone like me? The real question is, do you see me? Do you recognize my value? Do you see my qualities? Do you see my potential? Do you see me as a possibility? That is the emotional reality hiding underneath the conversation. I remember hearing about two people who met through a local walking group. Over several weeks, they developed an easy friendship. They talked during walks, shared stories, laughed often. One evening after an event, they found themselves watching the sunset together. The conversation slowed. Silence settled comfortably between them. Then she quietly asked, "Would you ever date someone like me?" There it was. Not a dramatic declaration, not a grand confession, just a simple question carrying enormous vulnerability. He looked at her and replied honestly, "If the connection felt right, absolutely." The transformation in her expression was immediate. Not because he promised anything, not because he guaranteed a future, but because he acknowledged the possibility. And sometimes, acknowledgement is all someone needs. By now, you may have noticed a pattern. Every question we've discussed appears different. Different words, different topics, different contexts. Yet they all serve the same psychological purpose. They're trying to answer an unspoken question. Is there room for me in your life? That's what makes these interactions so fascinating. The words are rarely the main message. The emotions underneath them are. And this is where awareness becomes incredibly valuable. Most people listen only for information. Emotionally intelligent people listen for meaning. They pay attention to tone, timing, context, energy, the feelings underneath the words. That's where attraction often lives. especially later in life, because attraction after 50 is frequently subtle. Not because feelings become weaker, because wisdom becomes stronger. People learn caution, they learn discernment, they learn the value of emotional safety. And as a result, attraction often arrives quietly. A question, a smile, a moment of curiosity, a little opening, a chance to move closer. The men who succeed most in relationships aren't always the most handsome. They aren't always the wealthiest. They aren't always the most charismatic. More often than not, they're simply the most attentive. They notice. They pay attention. They recognize emotional opportunities when they appear. And they respond with warmth rather than fear. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I want you to remember something important. None of the questions we've discussed were really about obtaining information. Not truly. They were about understanding possibility. A woman asks about your age because she's evaluating confidence. She asks about marriage because she's evaluating emotional availability. She asks about your preferences because she's evaluating compatibility. She asks whether you'd date someone like her because she's evaluating possibility. Different questions, same underlying purpose. And once you begin recognizing that pattern, conversations start looking very different. You'll notice subtle invitations that previously went unnoticed. You'll hear meaning hidden beneath ordinary words. You'll become aware of emotional signals that most people completely miss. And that's powerful. Because meaningful relationships rarely begin with dramatic moments. They begin with awareness. They begin with curiosity. They begin with two people slowly discovering whether there's something worth exploring. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might benefit from it. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever realized, days, months, or even years later, that a woman was showing interest and you completely missed the signs? Let me know. Because your experience might help someone else recognize what they've been overlooking. And remember this, the next time a woman asks a question that feels surprisingly personal, don't rush to answer. Pause. Pay attention. Listen beyond the words. Because sometimes the question you hear is only half the conversation. And the answer that changes everything is hidden in the part she never says out loud.